rejoice and be glad today. Whether in your car, in your house, the single you got a spouse. It's now time to open up your mouth and let the praise out. Femi Sachs, what we telling them?
This is a day, bro.
Okay, let me hear it.
This is the day, Lord, you have made. We will rejoice and be.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. Happy Tuesday morning to each and every one of you. I am excited to be here for our daily devotion on today. So we ask that as you come in, just say good morning. We are excited to be here today and to talk about what God has given us for today's daily devotion. So as you're coming in, say good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Today we are going to be talking about opposition and how sometimes opposition is really confirmation that we're on the right path. And so we're going to be coming from the book of Nehemiah on today. We're going to be discussing chapter 4 on today. So we're going to start at verse 1 and kind of work our way through there. So if you want to join us in Nehemiah chapter 4. Verse 1, and it reads that Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan officers, "Why does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think that they're doing? Do they think that they can build the wall in a single day by just offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap and charred ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, "That stone wall would collapse if even a fox walked along the top of it." But verse 4 says, "Then I prayed, 'Hear us, our God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land. Do not ignore their guilt. Do not blot out their sins, for they have provoked you to anger here in front of the builders.'" And so how many times does it feel like that once we begin to follow God and to make progress, that the enemy begins to make noise? When we're stagnant or we're in a season of complacency, there's also a lot of silence. The enemy is in agreement with your standing still, so it's kind of like this silent cheering on. And we tend to be okay with silence as agreement. But as soon as you start to build, and as soon as you start to build your faith, here comes the noise of the enemy. When you begin to build your family moving closer to God, you begin to move your finances closer towards the future that God has prepared for you, then here comes the noise of the enemy. I believe we can become confused about the noise of the enemy because it may not come across as we think it will. It often will not only come across in an audible sound, as we heard in the first couple of verses, but that voice sound of noise will often come through our thoughts, our feelings, our fear, our anxiety, and our worry. This noise from the enemy often manifests in thoughts or feelings that contradict God's love, peace, and truth. And when that happens, that leaves room for doubt, fear, and discouragement to come in and take place. These thoughts and feelings ultimately hinder our growth and our connection to God. The noise, as it continues, can amplify, becoming louder and louder, these feelings of fear, anxiety, and worry, making it difficult to trust God's guidance. So if we get a little backstory, King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon has raided Jerusalem and burned the temple and tore down the walls and took God's people captive. This is so important to note because when a city doesn't have walls, it is unprotected and exposed. The walls represent identity, it represents protection, and it represents God's presence. So when Nehemiah gets permission to build, it's not about the building itself. It's not about the actual bricks or the stone, but it's about building his spirit, building spiritually. So if we go back and look at verses 1 and 2, it says Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do you think they can build the wall in a single day just by offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap, and charred ones at that?" When the enemy attacks what you're building, there is a mental attack. It is an attack of criticism. It is an attack on your self-esteem. It brings doubt into the picture. It brings discouragement in, and it's usually said in front of an audience, right? So the scripture tells us that he was in the company of his cronies, and he asked, "What are you doing?" when clearly he could see what they were doing. And to say phrases like, "Do they think?" causing you to have self-doubt. But I like in verse 4 what Nehemiah does. Verse 4 says, "Then I prayed, 'Hear us, our God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their own heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land. Do not ignore their guilt. Do not blot out their sins, for they have provoked you to anger here in front of the builders." What does Nehemiah do in the presence of being mocked, in the presence of the noise that is coming? He doesn't respond to the critics or even the cronies, as it talks about. He doesn't even try to defend himself, but his first response is to go to God in prayer. Is that your first response? When things are loud around you, is your first response to go to God in prayer? When it is time to silence the noise around us, we must first go to God in prayer. And one thing we have to know about it is that noise doesn't cancel noise. I think that is so powerful. Let me say it again. Noise doesn't cancel noise. And so we have to stop wasting our energy responding to the noise, responding to the critics, whether we're doing it back verbally, whether we're posting on social media, whether we're sharing with others. The way to defeat noise is with silence to the world and conversation with God. Again, the way to defeat noise is with silence to the world and conversation to God. And I believe it's our human nature that we want to use a popular term. We want to clap back. We want to defend ourselves. We want to, expose them. But here Nehemiah is giving us an example that when the critics are talking, when the enemy is talking, when the noise gets louder and louder, before we let it affect our self-esteem and cause doubt to come in, our first response is to go to God in prayer. And I'm going to skip down to verse 6, and it says, "At last the wall was completed to half its height around the entire city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs, Ammonites, and Ashdodites heard that the work was going ahead and the gaps in the wall of Jerusalem were being repaired, they were furious. They all made plans to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw us into confusion." But here we go again at verse 9. "But we prayed to our God." So we already know back in verse 4, the first thing we did was prayer. But here comes number 2, "and guarded the city day and night to protect ourselves." So the first thing we're always going to do, phase 1 of our strategy, is always go to God in prayer. But phase 2 is preparation. All right. We can't only pray. We know faith without works is dead, and we can't prepare without consulting God. So we must make sure that we're following these steps in order. First one is prayer, and then preparation. When the enemy sees what they're doing has now been countered, they have to come with more. This is why preparation is so important. When they realized that the breaks in the wall were being fixed, they were absolutely furious. They put their heads together and decided to fight against Jerusalem and create as much trouble as they could. So now it's not only the noise, it's the self-doubt, it's the feelings of inadequacy, worthlessness, discouragement, but now the fight becomes physical and we have to stand guard, set around the clock guard against them. That came out of the scripture. We have to prepare to meet the threat. So after you pray, you have to position yourself for victory. Faith without a strategy is a fantasy. And so we must trust God, but also guard our progress. The scripture tells us that the wall was finished in 52 days, right? What has been broken for years, God can rebuild quickly. 52 days they were able to rebuild. So you see, the enemy doesn't mind the ruin as long as you aren't trying to get restored. The enemy does not mind the ruin as long as you aren't trying to get restored. You see, the enemy doesn't mind you coming to church as long as you're not looking for a breakthrough. The enemy doesn't mind that you're in that relationship when he knows it's not with the person that God has for you. The enemy doesn't even mind your worship as long as you aren't trying to make it a lifestyle. Worship is a lifestyle. So again, we go back. The first thing we have to do when we're faced with noise from the enemy is that we have to pray. The second thing we have to do is we have to go into preparation. We're going to go down to verse 10. Says, then the people of Judah began to complain. The workers are getting tired. There's so much rubble to be moved. We will never be able to build the walls ourselves. Meanwhile, our enemies were saying before they know what's happening, we will swoop down on them and kill them and end their work. The Jews who lived near the enemy came and told us again and again, they will come from all directions and attack us. So I placed armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas. I stationed the people to stand guard by families armed with swords and spears and bows. Here again, we're talking about preparation. Then as I looked over the situation, I called together the nobles and the rest of the people and said to them, don't be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord who is great and glorious, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. Verse 15, when our enemies heard that we knew of their plans and that God had frustrated them, we all returned to our work on the wall. All right, preparation, we're in place. But from then on, only half the men worked while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. The leaders stationed themselves behind the people of Judah who were building the wall. The laborers carried on their work with one hand supporting their load and one hand holding a weapon. All the builders had a sword belted to their side. The trumpeters stayed with me to sound the alarm. So we know that something is coming. And this is where I wanted to get to. Verse 19 says, then I explained to the nobles and officials and all the people, the work is very spread out and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. When you hear the blast of the trumpet, rush to wherever it is sounding, then our God will fight for us. So the third part of this, so the first piece is prayer, the second piece is preparation, and the third piece is prevail. To prevail means to succeed, to win, to become dominant. And so throughout the building of the wall, there were consistent obstacles coming after Nehemiah, but he never stopped building. When we fully rely on God, we can continue to build brick by brick with his protection around us, even when others are trying to dissuade us, tear us down. God is right there fighting for us, silencing the enemy, but we must be ready for the fight. So I say to you on today, when it feels like there's so much noise coming from all directions, when it feels like the enemy is speaking louder, I just encourage you today to go to God in prayer, turn down the noise of the enemy, turn up your conversation with God, get get into position and preparation and know that God will fight for you. God will give you the victory over whatever this situation is, over whatever this circumstance is. We know that God will give us the victory, that he will continue to fight for us. So let this example from Nehemiah, take it and put it into your situation in your life so that you can pray, prepare, and prevail. I hope this has been a blessing to you on today. So excited for this opportunity to be here with you on today. I pray that you have an amazing and blessed day. And we'll see you back here tomorrow, 8:30. Have an amazing